Today we're looking at Epicurus, and just like when we spoke in the last lesson about the Stoics, we're going to split his ideas up into physics and ethics. I'm like Epicurus a lot. The same with the other guys as well. I like them all for different reasons. But it seems to me that this guy is a very down-to-earth guy, and what I mean is he isn't perhaps as pretentious as other philosophers, and he seems to bring philosophy down to earth, and I hope I can show why that is. So firstly, looking at his physics, he's very much an atomist. He read Democritus, one of our previous philosophers, and he thought that this was a very strong argument, clearly, because he spends a lot of the literature which we have left from Epicurus, some of his writing, most of it is devoted to physics, in particular to atoms, and in particular to how atoms, the idea of atoms and void, can explain a lot of natural processes. So he starts off by telling us that nothing comes from nothing. I hope you remember that this was Parmenides who first came up with this idea. Now notice that the Stoics, Epicurus, most of the ancient philosophers after Parmenides as well, they all seem to agree with this Parmenides discovery that nothing can come from nothing. And I want you to remember that this is the opposite to what people who follow the modern scientific model, it's the opposite to what people believe nowadays, because nowadays we believe there was a Big Bang and that everything came from nothing about several billion years ago. Everything came from nothing. So now we believe the opposite to these ancient sages. Secondly, he goes on to explain why there must be bodies and void. One of the reasons he mentions is that sense perception demonstrates that movement is certainly possible. Now, if movement is possible, he concludes there can't only be bodies, there must be void if movement is possible. Movement would be impossible without some kind of void, some kind of space for the bodies to move into, and so there must be atoms and void, bodies and void. And you'll notice that sense perception is very important for Epicurus. He believes that it's the most important, the most direct way of knowing the truth. So his epistemology, it champions sense perception. This is different from Parmenides, who you may remember was an extreme rationalist. He believed that sense perception was deceitful. He didn't believe our senses told us the truth. He believed that through the principles of rationality we could directly discover the truth, simply by applying logic and reason. Number 3, some bodies were compounds of atoms, so they weren't just all elements. Some were compounds of atoms, which is like modern ideas. However, I would like to add that the soul and gods were both things which Epicurus believed existed, but they were both things which Epicurus believed were made of atoms. The gods were made of atoms, the soul was made of atoms. So it's a very different idea to what these words mean nowadays. Another thing which he mentioned was that the totality is unlimited. The number of atoms is unlimited, and the magnitude of the void is unlimited. So for Epicurus, the universe has no limits. This was an idea which, again, was quite widely believed at the time. You may remember the Stoics believed that the number of atoms was finite and the void was infinite. Well, Epicurus disagrees, because he believes that if that were the case, he explains, the atoms would just diffuse and move further and further away from each other, and there would be no clumping together of large planets or suns. And it seems like a reasonable argument to me. This diffusion is certainly a scientific principle. It's well known that gas will just diffuse if it's surrounded by a void, and so if the void were infinite and the number of atoms were finite, he doesn't see that as realistic. He thinks there must be an infinite number of atoms and an infinite void. Now again, remember, this is not what we currently believe, although for myself, in my opinion, Epicurus' argument is much stronger than the modern beliefs in a limited universe or a Big Bang. So next he comes on to the idea that atoms and void are eternal. Of course, this is different from nowadays as well. He doesn't believe there's any limit in time to atoms and void. So here he agrees with the Stoics that time is eternal. Basically, these will exist forever, atoms and void. And lastly, he believes that the properties of atoms are determined only by three things: their shape, weight, and size. And that if we look at the shape, weight, and size of the different atoms, we can use this to understand how all natural processes occur. Okay, now, one thing which he differed from Democritus, and he differed here from the Stoics as well, he was not a determinist. He believed in free will. He didn't believe that these atoms just entered into a chain of causality, which was just cause, effect, and that everything therefore was predetermined. He didn't believe that. He believed that all atoms swerved randomly, and that this random swerve, which just means they didn't move in a straight line, they swerved, was where free will came from. All the thoughts in our head were the random swerves of atoms, and this is where free will came from. So he's the first atomist to get rid of determinism and bring in free will. He's not a determinist. Next, I've already mentioned this, but he championed the empirical method, which is it is the scientific method that you if you have an idea, you test that idea with a real experiment, and the results of the experiment, you take in the results through your sense perception, and that whatever the experiment says it either confirms or denies, or rejects the idea which you had. And so he's very much an early scientist. He prefigured the scientific method, and later on, later scientists would go back to Epicurus, the early atomists, and look at his work and try and understand the world around them using his ideas. So he championed the scientific method, and he, as we've said before, for him the senses were not deceitful. They were the most direct way of knowing about the world around us. The way we usually made a mistake, according to Epicurus, was in our concepts, which are our preconceived notions. So it's not our senses which are deceiving us. The thing which deceives us is the preconceived ideas we have. We make mistakes in the concepts that we create. And because of this, we make mistakes. Our senses seem to contradict sometimes our concepts, but it's the concepts which are wrong. It's not our senses which are wrong. The last criteria of truth was emotions. So the emotions can also give us some knowledge about the world, but the emotions for Epicurus are simply related to pleasure and pain, feelings of pleasure and pain. Now this brings us on to his ethics, because ethics for Epicurus, virtue is simply maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain in our everyday experience. This is virtue. And the opposite would be maximizing pain and minimizing pleasure. This would be a bad course of action. So he's a very practical guy, Epicurus. I think very down to earth. Virtue is simply having a happy, nice, pleasant life, and vice is simply having an unhappy, disagreeable life. And so he's quite famous for saying it's impossible to live a pleasant life without living wisely, well, and justly. And the reverse. It's impossible to live wisely, well, and justly without living a pleasant life. A pleasant life comes from simply following this maxim. And Epicurus was famous for coming out with a lot of very simple maxims, and I mean simple sentences, phrases, which people could use to live by. He was trying to make it possible for people to be happy, and he was trying to use a practical method to make people happy. Now his ideas, they were around for hundreds of years, and there were many communities that followed these ideas. In these communities women were allowed, which made it quite before its time, because Plato's Academy, for example, they didn't allow women to join. There was also no need to give up your money, your personal property to the community when you joined. There was no need to do that, and that's obviously very different from several communities that I can think of where you do have to give up your wealth or your possessions to the community, to the good of the community. Now, he put these expressions, these simple maxims, they're found on old hand mirrors and jewellery. It was something which people would put them around their houses so that they could remember these ideas and they could live by these principles. Now, his 4-part cure to health was simply: don't fear God, don't worry about death. What is good is easy to get, and what is terrible is easy to endure. Now, we'll come on to God and death in a second, but what is good is easy to get. For Epicurus, simple things were good things. He wasn't really so interested in complex pleasures, because complicated pleasures would often lead to a lot of pain as well, and he believed in minimizing pain. And so he was really talking about simple food and water, everyday things that you need. These are good, and they're easy to get. It's not so difficult to get food and to get water. He believed it was easy to get these basic necessities. And he also believed that pain was easy to endure. And he died in terrible pain. He died from kidney stones, and it's reported that he was still happy. He did he was a practical guy, and he was pleasant even in his last few days when he was in extreme pain. And so he did try and live by his philosophy. So to come on to death, for Epicurus, there's no pain in death. I think we would all agree that you can't feel pain when you're dead. You can't feel pleasure either. But for this reason, death is nothing to us. Now, they used to have something written on their gravestones, which was: I was not, I was, I am not, I do not care. This was to show that they believed that in the beginning they didn't exist before they were born. Then they existed, then they stopped existing, and it doesn't matter. So quite a... really quite an indifferent attitude towards death. They didn't think it was anything to worry about whatsoever, and that's why they said, don't worry about death. Now, they also rejected immortality of the soul. There was no afterlife. The soul wasn't immaterial, it was material, it was made of atoms, and so it also died. It wasn't immortal at all, it also died. And he believed in God, the gods, but they were very far away in the cosmos, and they weren't interested in us. An argument which I've put on the bottom: it may not have been written by Epicurus, it may have been written by a skeptic, and kind of being confused with Epicurus, but some scholars believe it's from Epicurus. But this is how the argument goes concerning God. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. He wants evil in our world. Is he both able and willing? Then where does evil come from? If he could take it away, then why have we got some? And is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? So it's another reason why he's quite famous for being an atheist, I suppose, although I would deny that he's not an atheist. He believed that there were gods, but that they weren't interested in us. But I thought I'd put it up there just because it was quite an interesting argument, and it's very often attributed to Epicurus. Whether it is or not, who knows. Anyway, if you have any ideas about these theories, or about atomism, about nothing comes from nothing, or that totality being unlimited, about any of these things, about free will and determinism, or about any of the ethics, please write them under the video, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks for watching.